Never sleeps. In the city that never sleeps. Capitalk 100.4 FM. All day, every day. Capitalk 100.4 FM. Harari's Height. Hashtag 9 and Fly.
So joining me in the conversation now is Itai Zimunya of the Zimbabwe Taxpayers Platform. Itai, good evening and thanks so much for joining us in the conversation. I hope you're well.
Excellent. Good evening to the listeners and hope you're well as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. We're unpacking some of the core changes that, some of these taxes will bring in. I think the first thing is the fintech tax on the gross rental income. So landlords are not very happy about that. And then the introduction of presumptive taxes as well, and the overall arcing objective of widening the tax base. So from your standpoint, what exactly are new tax measures, and who is going to be affected by these measures being introduced by ZIMRA?
Yes, thanks, Lumbi. So I think the first issue of clarification is that the digital services, withholding tax that was introduced, January, is largely gonna, target, services like InDrive, Bolt, but now there's talk in town that even content creators, like your MyTeach and others are gonna be affected because they also earn their money. And the number two, like you said, is that there's a new tax. In fact, it's not new. It was already introduced last year as well. This rental income tax. So this tax is not coming to affect people who are, paying tax on the residential properties, but it is targeting commercial. So your shops, industrial complexes, and bottle stores. All these are going to affect. So and definitely it's going to have a very serious consequence, to how the economy is structured in terms of pricing for basic commodities and the products that come from manufacturing centers.
So this will affect, Itai, you're saying that it's not going to affect those who are doing rental or shall we say residential properties. It's more for the commercial properties, if I get
That's correct.
Okay, all right.
Yes, correct, yeah.
So I think that's important because, a lot of residential people in residential market were very worried this, and they were saying, so it means that our gross is affected. But also let's talk about why it's being applied to the gross rental income instead of the profit.
So if you read, the minister's, I think it is coming with some form of a punishment to commercial, tenants or commercial, property holders who have not been paying tax, from the period 31 December 2025 backwards. So he gave, Minister Mtuli gave an olive branch to those that have been paying, tax on rentals up to the period of 2025. So there's an element of a punishment here, from the ministry. And I think it's a little bit unfair because, you'd assume that a person who started their business on the 1st of February 2020 can't really be punished for not paying tax in 2025 because that business didn't exist. So I think it is that element, of punishment and sticks that we see both from the ministry and from ZIMRA that we think must be eliminated because the conscience and I think, attitude of government when it is engaging citizens must always come with, compassion, with utmost good faith and trust. So I think this end of punishment that perhaps must be eliminated so that, taxpayers, also feel equally competitive with those that were paying tax before 31st of December 2025.
And for someone who is really to understand, the differences in the applicable taxes, when it's a presumptive tax, Itai, what exactly does that mean? And also, secondly, what's being taxed here is the gross income, not profit. What effect does that have as well?
Yes, so the presumptive nature, here is basically saying the government or ZIMRA here in this case is not interested in calculations because, when you pay tax, there are lots of other deductions or allowances, that accountants or bookkeepers put when coming up with the final tax to be paid. But in this case, the minister is saying, I don't want this mathematics. The gross income that you get is what you must calculate 10% of and give it to ZIMRA. But it doesn't end there. I think what is exciting, exciting or funny, depending on which side of the table you sit here, is that the minister has given power, to test, to deduct this tax to ZIMRA. So in short, we are saying if I'm your tenant, Rumbi, and I pay, say, $100 rent per month, so it means I won't be giving you $100. I'll give you $85 and take the $15 straight to ZIMRA. And, that provision is, my landlord or my lady can't punish me, for paying ZIMRA, because then government protect me either eviction or from a punishing, increase in rentals. So that's the kind of scenario that is coming, in this with this new tax where tenants are paid by the government to collect them to ZIMRA. So this is the test.
And looking further, at the impact on the landlords, whether it's commercial or residential, how does this 15% tax, the presumptive tax on their gross rent, practically affect them? And I'm looking here at how operating costs. Is there an effect at all that maybe was not looked into, or is the effect not much to write home about from your standpoint?
I mean, this is too much, and this is always our argument as the Zimbabwe taxpayer from that. If you look at the kind of taxes that we do pay Zimbabwe, it's just so much, and the rates are so high to an extent that one, might say it doesn't make sense business in Zimbabwe. So if you are in business and you are paying 15%, on gross rental income. Suppose you are a big business and you are subletting part of your, factory to other players so that at least you recoup some bit of revenue for other, uses. That means that in this case, 15% is going to the government on the same income. If your income is above $25,000, dollars per year, it means you are also supposed to be paying value-added tax. And it is the same, companies also pay income tax if it's every year. And it is business which, when it brings its money, also pays a whole bunch of taxes and fees. Your bank charges, your withdrawal fees, and a whole lot of other. And if you park, on the streets of Gweru or Mutare, you're still supposed to meet, these municipal obligations. But this is just one business and stuff like that. So if you then look at the composite nature of our taxation and levies, it's just too much. It's just too much, And
then obviously the issue that I think a lot of people are concerned about, particularly the tenants, is that they will have this passed on to them, that this cost will be passed on to tenants. Do you expect that the landlords in commercial setups will pass on the costs for tenants? And what will this mean for rental prices going forward?
So definitely, obviously, the rental prices will go up, but they don't end there. It basically means that this will give what we call a cost push inflationary pressure. So the final producer will try and increase cost of the product that they sell on the market. But when you look at it from a broader scale, it's unfortunate for Zimbabwe because only 2 days ago did we hear our president and the president of Botswana, His Excellency Duma Boko, that they want to increase the volume of intercontinental trade within Africa. So we are saying if we open up Zimbabwe to the continental trade, when our produce products are so high in terms of cost of production, it basically means that our companies won't be able to compete. And I always give the example of milk. That 1 liter of milk in retailing for about $1.50, in Zimbabwe. And yet that's the cost, of a retail cost of 2 liters of milk in South Africa. 2 liters of milk in Botswana. What are we saying? Are we saying the cattle or the milking cows of South Africa and Botswana are so special that they have more milk than those of Zimbabwe? It comes back to the structure, of our production. Even bread price. Bread is not supposed to cost $1. In South Africa, it's about 80 cents. Botswana 80 cents. Zambia 80 cents. Why is it $1 in Zimbabwe? It goes back to the cost of production. So I think when the president is declaring that we are opening up Zimbabwe to business, then it follows that the finance, the whole other, a cluster of economic ministries, be it agriculture, industry and commerce, trade and stuff like that, are supposed to enable the reduction of cost of production in Zimbabwe so that it benefits the consumers, but also make the Zimbabwean companies, able to compete on the continent. And I think once we do that, both in the medium term and long term, the economy will rise. But currently, it will just be sitting around and suffering from this huge burden of high production costs. And it's quite unfortunate.
Indeed. And Itai, I'm just thinking, that this presumptive tax is targeted solely at the commercial properties. Some might ask, Koma residential, why are residential properties exempt and why are they not, included also to bear this burden?
Yeah.
How would you answer that?
Yes.
I'm making you step into Professor's shoes.
Yeah. No, definitely. So the minister did, in this not to include residential properties, in this tax bracket, because the assumption is that normally people who rent properties across Zimbabwe are classified within the low income status, because those that are within the middle to income normally have money to buy own houses. So we are saying by buffering, this low-income sector from paying, a tax on rentals, means that the little income that the Zimbabwe low-income earners are earning, at least is protected from this extra taxation. Because you might remember that the tax ratio of the income is very low, and I think we still continue to in the Ministry of Finance and to be fair, especially to the low-income earners, and the paradox. So if you earn $100 in Zimbabwe, you're supposed to pay income tax, and at the rate of 15%. So it means you're supposed to take $50, give it to ZIMRA, and take $85 home. But if you earn $99, there's no tax. You take $99. But in South Africa, the threshold starts around $235. So the argument that we continue to make in Zimbabwe is that possibly there's a reason and an argument to be made that the Ministry of Finance also increases the tax threshold to about $230 thereabout. What that would mean is that more money in the pockets of civil servants and low-income earners in Zimbabwe. And from an economic perspective, when that happens, it actually boosts the economy as well, in that it increases aggregate demand by individuals and actually make people happier than for the government to take money when earning $100 and then try and use the money. So I think that's the paradox, that let money stay and sit in people's pockets than for the government to and try to make things on behalf of ordinary citizens. So that's the debate.
Quite interesting indeed. And to our listeners, if you're just joining us, it is the exchange on Capital 100.4 FM, and we are talking about the very, very real issues around the introduction of a 15% tax on gross rental income, the introduction of presumptive taxes that will largely be affecting landlords of or who are running commercial properties. And we are here with Itai Zimunya, just unpacking some of these new measures, and more importantly, how they will impact the rental market and beyond. Itai, there was a very important announcement made by the Zimbabwe Revenue Authority, and I always love these because it gives you rope as the voluntary disclosure. How effective is the voluntary disclosure window? I think it runs up until the end of May. Is it really going to encourage compliance? Maybe, take a few steps back and, explain to our listeners that, when voluntary disclosure is being given, what does it mean? Because many people are like, sure. If all along they're taxing us and now they're saying, come forward, is there no punishment? How effective are announcements like this for voluntary disclosure?
Yes, definitely it comes with punishment. ZIMRA does that. So from the 5th of June, I think we must expect more bees, from ZIMRA really coming into or onto commercial properties to assess whether people are registered and actually paying these taxes or not. And that window of opportunity of up to the 31st of May says if you voluntarily disclose that you have not been paying tax, then ZIMRA will allow you, to obviously register and clear your tax obligations, possibly from the 1st of January 2026. Then if it's the 1st of June 2026 and it actually comes to your properties that you have not been paying tax, they will calculate what is due to them and multiply that by 2. So it will be the total obligation of tax plus 100% penalty. So so there's a big challenge, there, Rumbi. The challenge is that, and it has been raised, by the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission and also by the Auditor General, that these methodologies seem to give ZIMRA officials, unfair advantage to fleece, business people to pay rentals to the ZIMRA agents, officers themselves. So I think what will actually benefit, or we will benefit from this whole exercise, are ZIMRA officers and not the government of Zimbabwe, because it's been recorded even by the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission that when ZIMRA officers present themselves to these commercial entities, they normally also ask for their own, personal, favors to use whatever leeway they do have within the system to buffer that percent and possibly get paid 20% direct to themselves. So whilst on one end we understand that the government needs this money, but on the other end, I don't think they've sufficiently dealt revenues of how people ought to register and pay for this tax. We know there's, the terms platform which the ZIMRA has, introduced, but it accompanied by, I think, equally important civic education, both to the public and to the community on how terms work and what lines, in Gweru, in Gwanda, in Beitbridge, for people to engage ZIMRA online, to pay for these taxes and stuff like that. So I make environment, accompanied by this threat, also double taxation coming the first, is not good for them. And we are also engaging ZIMRA on this so that they might need to take lessons from ZEC, for example. ZEC publicly announces that an election is coming, be it in a constituency or not, and people would know. Why can't ZIMRA, do the same to ordinary Zimbabweans, so that you don't seem to be ambushing people, but that Zimbabweans also voluntarily engage, in this exercise. So these are the issues, and we think that possibly if some ZIMRA and ministry people are listening, then definitely I think we need more of suasion than punishments. Thank you.
And Itai, just digging a little bit deeper into that, what would you recommend then? A longer period, for sovereignty, or maybe upon enforcement, not the 100% penalty? Because it's a very thin line, isn't it? Because the taxes need to be paid.
Yes.
Ultimately, these are people who are deriving benefit, and they get rent paid, etc. How is balance then struck? What should be happening? What do you think?
Correct. So yeah. I mean, there's a way out. So about 80% of business, especially that's going to be targeted by this new measure, fall within the small to medium, enterprise sector. Because if you realize what's been happening across Zimbabwe, in Gweru, Mutare, is dividing shops into smaller units, where some tenants, either the landlords, the owners of the buildings, or some middlemen, were actually subdividing this to earn, income, rental income. So because this is the sector that we are targeting, I mean, this is a huge sector, 80% of the country of Zimbabwe's economy. And I think what the government and ZIMRA must really do is deploy, the power of national radios, national television, and whatever avenue to do civic education and encourage people to do a voluntary disclosure and actually register for tax, But in this case, what we see is more like a sublime and quiet process, accompanied by a threat. And of course, that threat will actually even come to materialize. But we're saying governance by threats in economics actually causes more problems, even for the government itself, than governing by moral suasion. And that's why we always encourage ZIMRA in the ministry to deploy moral suasion, invest more in civic education. I mean, we do radios in Zimbabwe, lots of them. We do community radios, national radios. television and social media, and the government does have access, to these platforms. But it's very much cosmetic engagement on this, on this media, to the public. So that missing link is a bit of a challenge, and it will come back to haunt, Zimbabwe, everybody. Because if you shock business, normally what is, they will respond by raising prices. When they raise prices, what happens? We are bringing back inflationary pressures, and inflationary pressures, when they do come, they will fall. And when the zig falls, we are back to square one. So we are saying we need to balance all these equations and place business at the center of this, so that they don't, the business get forced to increase prices because rentals have gone up, or they are getting punished 100%, etc., etc.
You bring about a very important aspect, which, the drawing in of the small, medium enterprises, a lot of informal owners. You also talked about how to engage them better, which I think is something, and I hope that is something that can be taken up as the conversation continues. But let's look at some of the risks. Are there risks that some landlords may exit the market due to reduced profitability? Are there challenges foreseen in terms of, some of the previously unregistered landlords who might try and comply now? What are some of those challenges?
So I do follow, the ongoing discussions in the property sector, and the reality is that Zimbabwe is not yet built. Our stock of commercial properties and residential properties in Zimbabwe are still quite so few that I think there's still a huge demand. There's a huge, I think, market gap, for new properties, be they commercial or residential. And part of the, document, and I follow the blog, the Water, who is based both in Zimbabwe, Africa. So if you take a similar, say, commercial property in, let's say, Mganwini in Bulawayo or Harare, and compare it with that of South Africa, the one in Africa is far much cheaper and gets far less rent as Zimbabwe. So basically, if one way demanded, it means that the demand for rent spaces in Zimbabwe and the supply is little, which is why our rentals are high. So the solution to this, I think, from an end of business itself, is to follow the Chinese model. What are we looking for in the CBD? Get out, go to Chiota and establish your business there in the medium term. I mean, you can't just get out within 1 month, but I think people who do plan for their business for the long term begin to decongest or move out of the CBDs, move out of the traditional, industrial spaces, and go create new industrial zones in Goromonzi, in Mapisa, elsewhere, far away from this, what we call the medding spaces of the cities. And once you do that, I think you can be able to maintain your costs, one, by going solar in terms of energy, using local sources of water which are cheaper than the metered waters of Bulawayo and Harare and Taregweru. And so many other advantages that this brings. And this is a model that we are seeing emerging out of China, out of Ethiopia. And these are big growing economies, because when you do that, you control your cost of production and you can actually be able to compete. So I think these are the opportunities that business people themselves actually do have. They can't do it on the 1st of June, but definitely for the medium to long term, definitely they can do that. And it actually works.
I'll be bringing our listeners in just a moment. To our listeners, if you want to have your say, ask a question, the number is 0719 100 404. If you're a landlord, if you're a tenant, a very important discussion is being had now. And I think the takeaway there is, if you were not complying, you've got a window to come forward before a maximum double penalty is imposed. But Itai, you also talked about the digital systems that ZIMRA is using. How does the integration of digital systems like TAMS improve tax monitoring and transparency?
So I think the presupposition is that through TAMS, I know ZIMRA is working, flat out, make us more convenient, to business people and citizens, just as the South African Revenue Services, platforms are in South Africa. So, but currently, as we speak, today on the 27th of April, we can't be confident to say that TAMS is convenient to businesses. It still needs some technical capacity, some craft competence. And we're saying, I think the world has shifted, Rumbi, from a moment where a business needed tax consultants, to do taxation for the business. Now it has to be as easy as ABC. And once ZIMRA makes terms as easy as ABC as a platform where a person can sit, in the sofa of their office or house and get to the terms, link, get what they need to do, and actually pay using more money, we would say it's easier. But currently, it's a little bit restricted and a little bit heavy and problematic. And it is that structural challenge that we think is causing some problems that people might actually fail to comply, not because they don't want, but because the system itself is still a little bit heavy, loaded, of needing some craft competence, which many business people don't have time for and don't have the capacity, to kind of to manage.
A very important points that you make there, Itai. But as we are starting to round up and come to the end of our conversation, we're fast running out of time. What takeaway message would you have for the small to medium enterprises listening, the established landlords, the tenants, those in business, captains of industry, policymakers around, the wider reaching or broader impact around some of these measures, or maybe even, some of the goals behind the measures? Is it around revenue collection? Will it encourage formalization? Or could it be, a medley of all the above?
Yeah, so I would say it's a medley of all of the above, but I think what we need to do as business and citizens in Zimbabwe is to, I think, coordinate ourselves when it comes to taxation matters. So I would assume that, fairly medium to large businesses and corporates must actively participate, within the Zimbabwe, Confederation of Zimbabwe Industries platform, or the, Zimbabwe National Chamber of Commerce. And the small to medium enterprises must just make sure that they are members of various small to medium sector associations, be they of the farming sector or manufacturing sector, because it is unfortunately these institutions that have a voice, when it comes to negotiating taxes and engaging the various ministries. Otherwise, at an individual level, it will just be yourself and the tax officer, and there's no argument. It's either you get the 100% penalty or your business gets closed. So I think we have an opportunity to join these national associations, registered and known, that engage the government, so that I think going forward, we can convince the government to reduce taxes, make our businesses competitive, and grow the economy, at the same time paying our taxes so that the government also does have the required revenue for it to function.
And lastly, Tai, in terms of rental prices, likely to go up from June the 1st? If you're prudent, if you're a prudent landlord, and don't quit that rent again, what can tenants expect realistically?
Well, look, I think if people do voluntary disclosure, there won't be much pain. But obviously, if ZIMRA then comes after the 1st of June, they won't. I mean, they are very clear that in this case, they can actually ask a tenant to prepay their rentals and stop paying rentals to the landlord, but get that money to ZIMRA. So ZIMRA has been very clear that they can ask tenants to pay rentals to ZIMRA and acquit that rentals with a receipt to the landlord to say, don't worry, your tax burden has been taken care of by your tenant. So I mean, it's rough, and I think the only option we do have as businesses is to comply with the tax authorities.
Oh wow, yeah, that's not something that I think our landlords want to hear. But I think
yeah.
Oh wow, but the message then is to comply, to avoid this happening.
Yeah, definitely. We comply and argue and discuss and ask for concessions within compliance. It's the dirty hands doctrine. We can't dirty our hands and want to make an argument with ZIMRA. We need to comply and argue.
Great. I think that's a good place for us to end the conversation, and a very clear message to all concerned. Just comply. And unozo chema wa badara, I think is the rule of thumb here. And I think it's good that there is this period of voluntary disclosure up until the 31st of May for you to actually come forward and say, no, this is where I stand with these these issues. But we've fast run out of time, Itai. Thank you so much for your time and for your insights. I was speaking there to Itai Zimunya of the Zimbabwe Taxpayers Platform, ZITA, and he was providing some very important insights in unpacking these new, or they're not new, the tax measures that were implemented 1st of January 2026. Itai, thanks so much. Take care. We certainly will be calling upon you in the future or after the 31st of May to see how things have fallen.
Sure. Thanks, Rumbi, and good evening to our listeners.
Fantastic.
Fabulous evening.
Thank you so much. Many thanks to Itai there, and thanking him for being with us on the exchange. Now we cross over to the news at exactly 8 p.m. Stay with us at the Gravitas Zone, coming straight after the news.
This is Rumbi Venge on Capi Talk 100.4 FM.